I'd like to give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the sponsors of terrorism are the very ones who are daydreaming about the downfall of Syria, just as they dreamt of burying Libya and Yemen, perhaps to help them go back to sleep. I am certain that if they do, they will be followed by nightmares and the curse of the Syrian, Libyan, and Yemeni people. From the very first days of the terrorist war imposed on my country, Syria, the United States, France, and Britain, that indeed deserve the name of the three musketeers defending terrorism. And regrettably, you mentioned Don Quixote, Mr. President, who was a just person fighting for justice. Those three states, in addition to other states outside this council, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, that call for formal, informal meetings and very informal consultations in various formats, that table resolutions one after the other in a way that has led the United Nations to leave its most important principles and purposes in defending international peace and security. It has become now, through the practices of some, a rostrum and a tool to defend terrorism in Syria, to defend it, protect it, market it, and undermine international consensus on its combating. We would not be surprised if the situation would lead a nomination by the government of these states of terrorists such as John al-Britani, Abu al-Murra al-Faransi, Abu Harira al-Amriki, Abu Maqdad al-Turki, Abu Ja'far from Aleppo, as stated by the US just now, Abdullah al-Mihaisini al-Saudi, Abu al-Rahman al-Kanadi. Maybe they should nominate them for the Nobel Peace Prize, or indeed, perhaps the UK and French governments could name a couple of streets in Paris and London after Abu Muhammad al-Jolani or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in eternal commemoration of their contribution to humanitarian action, the promotion of democracy, and the protection of civilians. We would ask the three musketeers today, where were you? Why were you silent? Why this shameful position vis-à-vis the bombing of the Russian field hospital today, the killing of 2 Russian doctors, the wounding of both workers and patients by the so-called moderate terrorists, those who are being defended by states inside and outside the Security Council by acts and by deeds and words. This field hospital is set up to treat innocent civilians liberated by the Syrian army and its allies from the terrorist Jabhat al-Nusra, who had held them as human shields. And this is a fact since terrorists entered Aleppo in the summer of 2012. De Mistura and his predecessor recognized this, as well as Stephen O'Brien. The liberation of about 100,000 civilians from Aleppo, including tens of thousands of children, was never a part of the plans of the governments of the Three Musketeers and their proxies. Those governments would have instead welcomed the achievements of the Syrian army and its allies, who are combating terrorism on behalf of the entire membership of the international community. Now that the threat of terrorism is present in every corner of the world because of the policies and the cheap political blackmail by those governments. I will not repeat before you the sufferings of our people in Aleppo because of the practices of terrorist groups, or indeed the horrific stories being told by those freed from the crime and barbarity of those groups. But I would tell you that the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, supported by its allies, will not surrender to the attempts by these three states and their proxies to exploit the Security Council to support terrorists in Syria. We will not let our people in Aleppo down. We will not hesitate in our constitutional duty as well as legal duty to expel terrorists from Aleppo, from every part of Syrian land. We will not hesitate to save Syrians from the scourge and practices of these groups in conformity with the principles of international law, in implementation of Security Council resolutions on combating terrorism, just like any state that holds dear its sovereignty in this international organization. Mr. President, the government of the Syrian Arab Republic and its allies have abided by the previous periods of calm because we prize the lives of Syrian civilians. However, those periods were just an opportunity for terrorist groups supported and directed by their handlers by some member states in the Security Council and outside to regroup, to reconstitute their forces, to obtain more weapons and more supplies, both in persons and in logistical and military helps to complete their crimes against the Syrian people. In this regard, the question that the Syrian people and the free international public opinion are asking is, at any time, in any period of this world, when did the Security Council, by a resolution, impose a truce with terrorists to merely allow them to take a new breath and rearm? In the face of such cheap political blackmail by the Three Musketeers, the Syrian government, supported by its allies, will spare no effort and has not since the very first days of the war against terrorism in respecting international humanitarian law, protecting civilians, and its duty to provide aid to all Syrians, including the opening of safe passage to civilians in Aleppo to ease their exit. Opportunity was also given to armed persons to lay down their weapons in order to restore peace and stability to the city. In return, international humanitarian organizations, their officials, including OCHA, that have cried tears before the Security Council, did nothing to help the people liberated by the Syrian army from terrorism in Aleppo, not until now at least. It is now the duty of member states of the international organization not to fall victim to the attempts by some member states of the Security Council and outside to force through resolutions that only strengthen terrorism and promote it in Syria. Terrorism that confronts every single one of you. I would like to say that all those who hold high the interests of the Syrian people must knock at the door of the Syrian government, and the address is known to all. A permanent member state of this council whose foreign secretary justifies the killing by Saudi Air Force of thousands of civilians in Yemen surely is in no place to make false accusations against others. Today, the foreign minister of the United Kingdom stated that Saudi Arabia crossed no red lines in Yemen, that the UK would continue to provide weapons and advice to Saudi Arabia in its war against Yemen. Word by word, this was the statement from the UK Foreign Secretary, in exact opposition to what the world is witnessing: the bombing of hospitals, the killing of civilians, and the destruction of infrastructure in Yemen. Thank you, sir.
I thank you for your statement.